You're listening to episode 16 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness researchers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Daniel Rechtschaffen joins us to speak about his work promoting mindfulness in our educational systems. Take a moment and imagine what your life may have been like had you been introduced to mindfulness as a child. What if it had been taught, practiced, and discussed every day in our K-12 schools? For many of us, that didn't happen. The positive impacts contemplative practices can have in our lives are often elusive, and the most basic, simple but not easy meditations remain elusive. But thanks to the efforts of a few dedicated people, our children may have a more integrated relationship with mindfulness. Daniel Rechtschaffen, marriage and family therapist, is the author of the upcoming The Way of Mindful Education, Cultivating Well-Being in Teachers and Students. He founded the Mindful Education Institute and the Omega Mindfulness in Education Conference. He leads mindfulness in education trainings and conferences at institutions such as the Omega Institute, Esalen, and California Institute of Integral Studies. He has helped create curriculum for organizations such as Mindfulness Without Borders, Mindful Schools, and the Mindful Mothering Project. Daniel leads mindfulness trainings for schools and communities around the world, such as the South Burlington School District, the Paideia School in Atlanta, and Phuket International Academy in Thailand. He has had amazing results teaching mindfulness to high school basketball and baseball teams. Daniel also has a private psychotherapy practice in the San Francisco Bay Area. And our guest today is Daniel Rechtschaffen. Daniel, welcome to Present Moment.
Thank you, Ted.
Tell us about your interest in mindfulness. How did you first encounter it, and how did that grow?
Well, I have an interesting history, different than many folks that I teach mindfulness to, who have often the story is that something happens in your life when you're a teenager, middle-aged, and all of a sudden have some deep realization and shifting into this awareness of mindfulness. I had the good fortune of being born right in the middle of the mindfulness storm, in that I was born at a place called the Omega Institute and grew up there. And this is a holistic learning center in Rhinebeck, New York, where different meditation teachers and gurus and shamans and folks who are channeling aliens were around me all the time. And I just assumed that was what every kid's upbringing was like.
I will say I've been at Omega, and I will say there are a lot of crystals there in the shop.
I grew up around a lot of crystals, it's true. I was a bit of a new age experiment, and I like to think the experiment was successful. Yeah, so I had the good fortune of growing up in that atmosphere with parents who did not I never did yoga or meditation or, wasn't told to hold crystals on my forehead or anything. I wasn't told to do any of that stuff, but I grew up around it. And, I would be in kind of the back of the hall playing, in a big pile of meditation cushions or something. But I'm sure that I was listening to Ram Dass or Deepak Chopra or whoever it was that was teaching. There was some way that it was seeping into my little kid ears, even from when I was a very young child, 3 or 4 years old. I remember having those deep thoughts as I was going to sleep as a child of what is this existence? What is consciousness? What's going to happen after I die? What I called the biggies as kids. And so I was kind of thrust into mindfulness practice, or what I think of mindfulness practice, of really kind of an examined consciousness since I was pretty young, and luckily had a lot of teachers around and parents who I could talk to about these things and give me really good advice about how to be with my emotions, how to be with my thoughts, how to examine my life. So yeah, my interest has been that, and my interest in teaching it has been understanding that most people aren't given an upbringing as I was, where kind of there's a holistic understanding and a kind of emotional connectedness.
And you've been involved in working with such groups as the MBA Project, Mindfulness Without Borders, Mindful Schools, and more. I'm sensing a theme here. You have an interest in mindfulness becoming available to children. Tell us about that. How did that start?
Well, I would say that came directly out of what I'm speaking about before, of having had this childhood for myself, of a really mindful childhood. And as I was, going to public school and going into my regular life, I realized that there was no way for me to be able to talk about these things with other people. I didn't know how to talk about spirituality I'd get kind of scared, confused faces. There was always this kind of split in me as a child of trying to figure out, how do I bridge this gap between my Omega life that I grew up with and my public school life. And so as I got older and studied philosophy and went to school for psychology and started really trying to understand how to communicate these deeper things to the regular world. Particularly, I'd always been interested in working with kids. Even when I was 20 and working at summer camps, I would try to teach kids how to do mindfulness practices, just because I was, I feel like I had this genuine interest I think that children, from my experience, have a deeper connection to spirituality, an easier connection to their emotions than we do as adults. We kind of, even neuroscience shows that our brains get far less creative, have less synaptic connection. We kind of narrow in our consciousness. And so I've always been interested in working with kids who I inherently feel like it's easier to teach mindfulness to, because they're in a deeper state of wonder naturally. I've also worked a lot with adults in my psychology practice, and it's harder once people have had 40 years of conditioning to help them really be in this open, mindful state. And so really what my interest in working with schools and developing curriculum and working with children in my therapy practices, how do we help kids maintain the natural wonder and inquiry that they're born with, and to let them know that these aspects of themselves are really beautiful and healthy, and to kind of set them down that course right at the beginning.
So what do you find most rewarding about developing these programs for kids?
What's most rewarding for me, there's a lot of different ways, because I've worked in a lot of different contexts. There's really 3 delineations of the way that these practices are being brought into schools, into youth-based settings. There's kind of the direct service teaching, which is what I began with when I was, maybe 6 years ago. I heard that this organization called Mindful Schools was starting, and it was probably the biggest light bulb moment of my life, where I just thought, teaching mindfulness in public schools, like, get me in there. So I called up Richard Shankman, who is a mindfulness teacher from Spirit Rock, who was helping start it, and just, tracked him down. And he gave me the good ability to be able to jump into schools, never having taught in schools before, but having a lot of mindfulness practice myself. And so that's one of the ways is how we started, which was just going into the schools as outside providers. The remarkableness of that is being able to go into inner city Oakland public schools or private schools, all the different schools we were working with. And every single every single classroom I've ever worked in, when I'm doing this type of work, even though they've never met me before, I'm this brand new guy, I'll lead a short practice, and every time there's at least a few students who will open their eyes afterwards with this eye-popping interest that something has happened for these kids, for this child, that they're looking at the world in a different way. I've often got the response from kids that they think it's like, they talk about the Muggle world of Harry Potter, and it's as if like all of a sudden there's like this other world going on. They'll say something like, I heard the buzz of the electric lights above us. And I'll say, you've been in this classroom for 4 months. Had you ever heard that sound before? And there's kind of this magic that happens with mindfulness when we start observing in a different way, kind of getting off the regular track of studying, of testing, and something really special about that. The other ways I've done this direct service, and then I've also been leading a lot of trainings, a lot of conferences. There's a lot of just working with teachers that I do. That's another piece which is so heartening for me, because I know for every single teacher that I'm working with, I'm supporting that many 30 students or however many students they're going back to create more of a systemic change, or training principals, training whole schools, which I do a lot of consulting with different school districts, being able to go in and work with parents, work with teachers, create an environment that's more mindful, not even needing to teach any of the practices particularly, just teaching a school how to focus on the whole child, on the whole teacher. And then I've also been doing a lot of cultivating, creating curriculum. And so that's another aspect. There's all of these different ways that I'm doing this, all of which the work bears different types of fruit, all of which I'm just really inspired to see how they're affecting change.
Outstanding. And in fact, you mentioned some of the things that happen when you're teaching mindfulness in a particular school system. And I'd just briefly like to mention, I'll link to this on the episode page for folks who are listening. The film Room to Breathe has Megan Cowan of Mindful Schools in that kind of situation, teaching basic mindfulness practices to students. Was there a little bit of a culture shock for you, Daniel, the first time you went into a school system? Was it a little different than Omega, for example?
And it depends on which schools, because I've been teaching in schools all over the country and even in other countries. So each school has its own world to it. I was really humbled when I started teaching because, as I said, I'd never been a classroom teacher before. And so I had a real crash course in classroom management. And I bow very deeply to classroom teachers and the skill that it takes to be able to create the boundaries, create the structures for kids to be able to feel safe and to learn, and simultaneously to be bringing these more empathic, attention-based skills. I mean, for me, one of the fascinating things that mindfulness does in teaching is every single time I step into a different classroom, whether it's a high school or whether it's an elementary school, every single time my body responds to the classroom like it was like a piano resonating off of another one. And that's where my mindfulness practice comes in. I was in a school in Atlanta a little while ago where I was giving a talk in front of 200 high school students when all of a sudden, 200 kids streaming into an auditorium, all of their clicks and all of the adrenaline and all of the experience of being a teenager. What often happens for me that I notice is it brings up all of my insecurity. Like immediately I'll be feeling fine, and all of a sudden I'll be sitting with 200 high schoolers and I'll actually feel like and think to myself, are my clothes cool enough? And I'm like, all of a sudden it comes upon me. And what I find that my greatest gift to them is for me to be able to feel whatever nervousness is in my body, any insecurity, and be able to use my mindfulness practice to be compassionate towards myself and understanding of what's the sensations moving through my body. And then to embody that and model that for them and not get caught in that stream. So every single classroom still that I go into, whether it's going into a kindergarten class where, all of a sudden there's kind of chaotic feeling going on, and it's with kindergartners, instead of the insecurities of teenagers, it's more of kind of a raw fears. And every single moment in a classroom for me when I'm being mindful is a deep practice for myself of how to be really present to myself, be really present to the students. The difficulty is actually the most beautiful part of it.
Tell us a little bit more about that. Let's explore what are some of the other difficulties you run across.
Well, as I said before, I do this work in several different contexts, so there's many differences. If I'm working with a bunch of teachers, it's very different than the difficulties and the resistances that I get from students. If I'm working in another school I was in recently in Vermont, I walked into a classroom and very clearly the teachers had said, this is the, low achieving, disorderly classroom. I'd just been in the classroom across the hallway, which was the, high achieving. Everybody was, sitting straight up at their desks and were very attentive and very good class. And then I went into this other class and it was, night and day. The kids kind of had like their hair over their faces and their baseball caps and, dark mascara and like it's just a very different room. And the first thing I always ask is if the kids have ever heard about mindfulness. And immediately one of the girls said, I can't do mindfulness. It's I have ADHD. It doesn't work. And whenever resistance comes up, like the students were very directly resisting, which I actually appreciate sometimes more than the high achieving classrooms. Because when I ask a high achieving classroom, how did that practice feel? Often they'll say, oh, I felt relaxed. It felt good. And maybe that's true. But sometimes there's a lot of trying to please the teacher.
Yeah, they're giving the right answer.
They're giving the right answer. And when I have a kid that says, I have ADHD, then I get really interested. I'm like, really? Tell me more about that. Okay, now we're in it together. Now we're in really clear communication. I can feel the student. And what I did with this class, and I got fascinating long conversation where I was saying, well, what happens? What happens when you try it? And they're saying, well, my mind gets all crazy and I try to breathe, but then like 5 minutes later, I notice I've left and I'm feeling all angry. And I say, wow, that's what happens to me also when I do mindfulness. That's why I do mindfulness, because my mind is all over the place and I have these emotions and it's really difficult. Do you like that your mind is like that? And we get this fascinating discussion. And I'm still in touch with the teacher from that classroom because he said it was such an instigating moment in that class that the kids got really interested. And we didn't get to practice maybe as much as the other class, but we got to really explore these deeper questions of, what's happening in our minds? What is attention? What are these things? And the kids ended up really, I could feel them really deeply. So there is a lot of resistance that you'll get in any classroom. There's resistance with any teacher. I go and I teach in schools and, the adults are just big kids. So there's some teachers who are really excited about it. And then some teachers are sitting there kind of, checking their phones and not interested. And, there's even some resistance from folks who are wondering, are we brainwashing their kids? Is this some type of strange Buddhist thing that we're bringing in? Which I'm always, very clear that this is attention training. This is empathy training. I could throw out the word mindfulness even and would be happy with it. And so every time that happens, we invite the parents or teachers who are worried in to check it out. And I've never had an experience where afterwards the teacher or parent wasn't a big fan of what we were doing because it's so clear that we're just trying to help their kids. But mindfulness is a difficult experience. I have resistance to mindfulness as well, because we're looking directly at what's true in our hearts and in our minds. And sometimes those are really, or often those are very vulnerable things. So that shows up in classrooms and teachers and students.
So tell us about getting mindfulness socialized in K through 12 education. Is this something you've been involved at all about? What are your thoughts on it?
I have many thoughts on it. I had the very fascinating experience about a year ago of being invited to this White House discussion about mindfulness. Obama wasn't there, but a bunch of Obama officials and people from the Department of Health and all types of different people, where John Kabat-Zinn was there and a bunch of the main mindfulness folks. And I was invited to talk a little bit about mindfulness in education. And at the end of it, they asked me to do a little write-up of my recommendations for policy suggestions. And I thought, this isn't something I can just do a quick write-up. What do I actually think about this? So one of the strange things about it is I don't actually, if Arnie Duncan, the Department of Education, came to me tomorrow and said, we're ready to put mindfulness in every single school, I would say, slow down. We're not ready for that. And we're not ready for that for many reasons. I think that we're ready to do it in lots of schools. There's lots of school districts. I was just saying, this Vermont school, the South Burlington, Vermont school district, is a remarkable public school district that I've been working with for years that has integrated mindfulness into every single classroom, kindergarten through 12th grade. There's lots of schools around that are doing this. Shocking amounts of schools that are doing full integration and are doing it beautifully, but really beautifully doing it from the ground up, where the main thing that I speak about in any training that I write about in my book continually is that this needs to be embodied. The teachers need to be able to embody these practices. This is not something that can be the next educational fad where we come in and all of the teachers and students are forced to do it and get tested on it. It needs to be something which is experiential, which is embodied, which isn't mandatory, something which we're inviting students into. And I don't think that the public school system quite knows how to do a fully optional, experiential teaching. And I hope that eventually it will, and that it'll transform more in that direction. And I'm really excited and interested to have more dialogue with policymakers about how to integrate social emotional learning, mindfulness, all of these more conscious, child-centered educational tools. And it makes full sense. And the reason that the education world is so interested in mindfulness right now is because all of this research is coming out showing how it creates better test scores and emotional regulation, all of these things that every single school wants. But I don't want it to become some curriculum that's mandated, because I think it would be easy for that to become a disciplinary tool, kind of a behavioral modification tool, which is going to be a very different direction than what mindfulness means to me.
Was it the South Burlington School District you're talking about?
The South Burlington School District, yeah.
Yeah, that's linked on presentmomentmindfulness.com on our links page, because they have a really good website, and they've been operating since 2008 with their wellness and resilience program. So I'm glad you mentioned that one in particular.
They have a book coming out soon as well on a curriculum of pulling together all their curriculum. So they're doing really wonderful work.
So let's talk about some other things that you work on. First, you are the main driver behind a Mindfulness in Education conference, which recently completed at Omega, and that's an every year conference. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so obviously, since I grew up at Omega, it's pretty remarkable for me to get to go back there every year and to bring this teaching back. Since it was my mindful education, it feels very full circle. After I was teaching with mindful schools for many years and creating curriculum for Mindfulness Without Borders and all these other organizations, I pitched it to Omega, since they're still family. And they were really excited about it. So I think that was 6 years ago. We put together this conference with John Kabat-Zinn and Linda Lantieri. As Linda's been my right-hand woman. She's been there every single year, and she's an amazing saint.
She does outstanding work, yeah.
And, every year we've had Goldie Hawn, who runs the Mind Up program, which is a wonderful program. We've had Congressman Tim Ryan. Every year we bring really wonderful folks who are interested in this. A lot of the main organizations. This year we had Daniel Goleman, who wrote Emotional Intelligence. We had Daniel Siegel, who wrote The Mindful Brain, and another, a whole bunch of really remarkable teachers. One of the highlights this year was I led a conversation between Danny Goleman and Linda Lantieri and Daniel Siegel. Daniel Goleman and Linda Lantieri created CASTLE, which is the Social Emotional Learning Center, and they created that 20 years ago. And talking to them about that, and then what their vision for the future was, and then getting Daniel Siegel up there, who just is able to explain what they're talking about in terms of neuroscience in such a remarkable way. Yeah, every year we have 200 to 300 people come together, and I also lead a 5-day teacher training afterwards every year, where I go more into curriculum and how to bring this back into schools. And it'll be happening next year as well, hopefully on as the movement grows.
Yeah, and that's a terrific set of speakers, and to have them in dialogue with that kind of setting where it's shared with others is just a tremendous asset to stepping this forward, particularly in your teaching institutions. You also have a book coming out soon, The Way of Mindful Education. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, that has been a labor of love. I'd always wanted to write a book, and it turns out the book writes you instead of you writing the book. For the last 6-7 years since I've been doing this work, whenever something amazing happens, as I'm developing curriculum, as I'm doing this, I've always been writing up lessons that work, writing up the ones that don't work, writing up the ones that do work, writing stories down. And so I've always had a vision towards turning it into a book. With all the different organizations I've worked with, there's just thousands of different lessons that we come up with that work, and we're always trying to figure out, how do we create curriculum which is really applicable, that we can really integrate into schools? Because as I said earlier, the main interest is we want the teacher to be able to embody these practices, not just kind of memorizing these lessons and parroting them to their students. We really want them to embody this. So what my question going into writing this book would be how to write a book where it's really training the teachers in their own mindfulness practice, in their own emotional intelligence practice, how they can really learn something and embody a kind of a mature, empathic attention towards their students. And then once they have been able to embody that, how can they teach these very practical lessons, breathing practices, compassion practices? And when I get to work with teachers for 5 days or even a year-long training that I recently led, in the year-long training, we did a 5-day silent retreat. And so, we're really giving the teachers an experience of what mindfulness is, really looking inside. And so in the book, the first half of the book is really about how teachers can cultivate their own practices, what it's like to be with your resistance to the students when you get angry, how to be able to be aware of your anger and not act out to your kids. All of the things we want for our kids, we want for ourselves as well. We want our own emotional regulation. We want to learn how to cultivate our own attention, our own compassion, which is hard sometimes in the midst of the swirl of a school day. And so the first half of the book is really about the teachers cultivating their practice and then how to embody that in the classroom. And then the second half of the book is really how to integrate the practices into the classroom. There's an entire curriculum, which I see more as a toolbox for teachers. There's a lot of wonderful curriculum out there. The Mind Up curriculum can be bought on Amazon. There's a lot of great curriculum that you can buy, and I recommend checking them out. Mine is more of a toolbox of all of the great practices that I've done and I've seen done, and Mindful Schools and lots of the other organizations gave me little sample lessons to put in the back of the book. So it's a real kind of toolbox of lessons and ways that these can be integrated into a classroom, with lots of discussions about stress and trauma, about diversity and inclusion, really how to work with different groups, different ages. So it's really meant for teachers, for schools to be able to use as a resource to understand how to bring this movement into their schools.
Well, for folks who are listening, the book, The Way of Mindful Education, Cultivating Well-Being in Teachers and Students, is going to be added to our resources. We already have the Mind Up programs and a number of other books there as well, so thanks for bringing those up. And Daniel, for people who are interested in finding out more, I believe they can find you on a couple of different sites. One is mindfuleducation.com, and another, your own site, danielrechtschaffen.com. And I do have that linked on this episode page. Our guest today, Daniel, thank you for joining us on Present Moment.
Thank you so much for all the work you do, Ted.
Today's quote is from John Kabat-Zinn's book, Wherever You Go, There You Are, Mindfulness in Everyday Life. The tack we take in meditation is simply to witness whatever comes up in the mind or the body, and to recognize it without condemning it or pursuing it, knowing that our judgments are unavoidable and necessarily limiting thoughts about experience. What we are interested in meditation is direct contact with the experience itself, whether it is of an in-breath, an out-breath, a sensation or feeling, a sound, an impulse, a thought, a perception, or a judgment. And we remain attentive to the possibility of getting caught up in judging the judging itself, or in labeling some judgments good and others bad. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.